Hi, everybody. My name is Matt Horne. I'm the Climate Policy Manager with the City of Vancouver. I'm going to be speaking about the corporate carbon pricing policy we have in place in Vancouver. It was approved in December of 2018, pretty hot off the presses. I'll speak a little bit to the design process and sort of where we got to in terms of that design, and happy to take any questions along that spectrum. Just a couple contextual pieces to share off the top. So this was an action in our Renewable City Action Plan, which was approved by Council in November 2017. It took us sort of most of 2018 to sort of work through the design process and the internal consultation and some light touch external consultation as well. And as I said, approved at the end of 2018. And also just give a thanks, I think Connor's on the webinar, but give a thanks to Metro Vancouver. They implemented a very similar policy about a year previous to that. So we were able to lean pretty heavily on some of the design work they had done as well. So let's see here. So in terms of agenda, some overlap with Marco's presentation. I'll go light touch on that. Did want to just touch the beginning in terms of what is corporate carbon pricing from our perspective. Just an example we've been using in our internal conversations to help explain that as sort of part of the capacity building process, some of the precedents we've been drawing on. Then sort of a chunk on sort of how we've actually designed it. So looking through the scope, the pricing schedule we've implemented, and also some decision-making guidance we've developed. And the last part I'll touch on is sort of some capacity building pieces we've built in, which I think is just a good opportunity to talk about how it's been perceived in different parts of the organization. So what is Vancouver's corporate carbon pricing? And I think very similar to the way Marco described it. And I just put this up front, and it's in developing the policy, this was sort of, I think, it was a pretty important barrier to get around. So we've pretty much included this slide at the front of everything we've done, because there's not a uniform way in which corporate carbon pricing policies are defined. There are there are definitely examples out there where dollars are transferred sort of between corporate entities, and we have defined it sort of similar to the way Marco described it in terms of it's a price on paper used in options analysis, so it's not a internal carbon tax per se. And so it's not that necessarily there was opposition to either model. I think we had a lot of internal stakeholders that were initially thinking about this as an internal carbon tax, where one department would pay finance for their emissions, and we decided fairly early on not to go down that route. And I think if you had people thinking about it in different ways, you ended up with fairly disconnected conversations about how it could work and what some of the implementation challenges might be. So we really tried to stress this piece up front. Just an example, and we did sort of some similar analysis on sort of testing some recent business cases with and without a carbon price. Just a simple example that we've used fairly consistently, both because there's not a lot of complexity to it, and also it is one of the examples where the decision does flip, is fossil natural gas versus renewable natural gas. So you can see here the price from Fortis, our gas utility, and if you're just looking at it on a straight up dollars and cents basis, it's a pretty clear direction to go with the fossil natural gas, $3 a gigajoule versus $9 a gigajoule. When you add in when you look at the carbon intensity on a life cycle basis, and then with the carbon price, you multiply or monetize that, you get a much higher carbon intensity for the fossil natural gas relative to the renewable natural gas. And when you add those together, it does result in a flip in the decision. So that $10 a gigajoule adder in the case of the fossil natural gas ends up being the higher price option at the end of the day. In this case, we've used $150 a ton to inform this example. But you can use sort of the same approach, whether it's a vehicle decision or looking at heat pumps across the board. Anywhere where you're doing that type of option analysis is how we've framed the policy in terms of we should be using the carbon price where we're doing an options analysis. Really quickly on precedents, this is sort of, I think, and happy to share this as well if it's helpful with other people. I think it covers similar material to what Marco has pulled together on theirs. Tons and tons of corporate examples out there, and sort of ranging across sectors from sort of entertainment to pharmaceutical to big oil and gas, and prices sort of as low as sort of $3 or $4 a ton up to, I think, 170 was the highest we found. And I think general patterns you'd find at the lower prices, they're less decision-making tools and more fund-generating mechanisms. And so Microsoft is a good example where they have an internal carbon price, I think at $5 a ton, use that to generate revenue internally, and they invest that in sort of green projects as part of their overall sort of greening Microsoft strategy. As you get to the higher end prices, they tend to much more frequently be prices on paper, where you're really trying to drive different decisions. At $3 or $4 or $5 a ton, you're not going to flip many decisions. Other governments, so both federally and provincially, reasonably common to see carbon prices or sort of social cost of carbon used, especially in regulatory decisions. So federal government, the BC government, we know uses it sometimes in their regulatory setting processes. A lot of sort of the Clean Power Plan and clean car regulations under the Obama administration in the US was set using social cost of carbon or internal carbon prices. Not a lot of local government examples we were able to find. So Metro Vancouver is sort of probably the example we most model ours after. New Westminster sort of, I guess, at a high level adopted a similar framework. I think they're still working through the implementation of that policy. Dawson Creek is another sort of small BC community that has had one sort of closer to 10 years using that policy framework. So sort of a bit of a BC pocket and sort of interests elsewhere. Not one where we're able to find sort of lots of local government examples though. So in terms of Vancouver's design, where we've landed, so the current scope is very much focused on our corporate emissions. So it's carbon pollutions from vehicles and mobile equipment, carbon pollution from city buildings, and methane emissions from the Vancouver landfill. So across that scope of emissions, anywhere we're doing options analysis on different types of vehicles, different space heating and water heating equipment, and sort of approaches to managing methane. The approach sort of from January this year going forward is to apply that carbon price in the decision-making process. We've also designed it with the intent of sort of being able to expand the policy over time. And we did consult on a fair bit of this through the design process, ended up with I guess a relatively narrow initial sort of scope for the policy, but I've worked some way through sort of the internal comfort process on other applications. I sort of listed a few sort of, I think, probably the leading examples where we would be most interested in extending the scope. So in a Vancouver context, we do have control of our building codes. We already sort of, when we're doing analysis on what the carbon intensity requirements or energy efficiency requirements and an update to the Vancouver building bylaws should be, we're already doing all that analysis, and plugging a carbon price into that analysis is quite a straightforward approach. And it's an area where I think the policy has a lot of appeal in terms of having a rigorous approach and extending the reach of that policy. Our neighborhood energy utility, which is our district energy system around Southeast False Creek, sort of as using the carbon price as a guide to increase or lower the carbon intensity of that energy utility. Right now, it's a mix of renewables, renewable sources, and fossil gas, and we want to sort of continue increasing the amount of renewable energy in that system over time, and the carbon price could provide us a good tool to guide those decisions. And the last one, has been sort of, I think, a growing number of conversations, particularly in our zero waste team, around projects we can do that are going to help other entities reduce their emissions. So looking at construction and demolition waste as a sort of diverting that from the landfill, sort of using it as a fuel source to replace coal use in cement kilns would be a good example, or upgrading landfill gas into a renewable natural gas to feed into the pipeline network. So those are projects that can have benefits from a citywide carbon perspective. They don't show up in our corporate inventory directly, so they don't fall into the current scope of the policy. But lots of interest in sort of thinking through how we can extend the policy to incorporate those sort of opportunities. This is a bit of a wordy one, but I guess sort of a high-level takeaway here. We've designed the policy to cover off Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. So both the direct emissions from a facility, the emissions associated with the electricity and any other energy coming into that, and also other indirect emissions associated with it. So if we're looking at natural gas, for example, we'd want to capture the the direct emissions from the building, but also thinking about upstream impacts in terms of extracting and processing and distributing that gas, wanting to capture that full life cycle of emissions. Recognizing as you go sort of from scope 1 up to scope 3, the quality of data does decline. We don't have a requirement to have all those data sources, and so there's the space to move ahead if there are gaps, but ideally striving to sort of fill in all those gaps over time. So in terms of the price, we looked at a fairly wide range, and I think probably the low end we looked at was $150 a ton, which would align with where Metro Vancouver landed in their approach. So sort of more of a fairly simple approach of aligning with another nearby jurisdiction. We also sort of looked at some of the research on social cost of carbon, and also did some research into what implicit prices on carbon are needed to achieve Vancouver, BC, or national targets. Certainly that latter category pushed towards higher prices, sort of more in the range of $250 to $300 a ton. Where we ended up was aligning sort of, I guess, a bit of a hybrid approach of aligning with Metro Vancouver initially at $150 a ton. That's inclusive of the BC carbon tax. So in essence, it amounts to, I guess, with the BC carbon tax having just gone up, it amounts to $110 adder on the BC carbon tax in those decisions. We've built an escalator into ours, which my understanding is that's not in place in Metro Vancouver at the moment. So it goes up at the rate which the BC carbon tax goes up through 2021, and then we've built in sort of a default of a 6% escalator in the price going forward from there. So it would, if we were to follow that price trajectory through sort of the various policy reviews, it would take it to about $300 a ton in 2030. So one of the big questions that came up in designing this was, so if we're setting a price at $150 a ton, if we had an opportunity to take our emissions to zero at cost $149 a ton, would this policy be guiding us to do that? I think there was definitely some hesitancy from finance in particular of the price tag associated with that, particularly in a short term. So what we ended up doing was sort of linking the corporate carbon pricing policy, certainly within the initial scope on our corporate emissions, to our corporate emissions reduction targets. So we've ended up with 3 scenarios. So if we've got an opportunity to reduce emissions that is, this is sort of scenario 1, an opportunity to reduce emissions that is less than the price we're paying directly in carbon tax. So right now, less than $40 a ton, we should be taking as many of those opportunities as we could find. Like we're saving the city hard dollars in that case, and that is less than the price of the carbon tax. So there's a direct savings to the city. For scenario 2, sort of from the price of the carbon tax up to the price we've set, so say 150 in 2019, the guidance is that we should be taking those opportunities if they're needed to keep us on track for our corporate emissions reduction targets. If we've got opportunities that we don't need to stay on track for our corporate emissions reduction targets, it's sort of left at a departmental discretion level as to whether or not those actions should be taken. And so, yeah, renewable natural gas would be a good example there, where we could switch to 100% renewable natural gas overnight in the BC policy framework. That would notionally take our emissions from buildings to zero. We're not doing that. We're sort of slowly increasing the amount of renewable natural gas we're using, and also sort of in the switching to heat pumps sort of on a capital replacement basis. The third scenario came up in that I think we had other parts of the city didn't want this policy to be like a hard ceiling or like a firm ceiling on actions, and there's definitely examples. I think heavy duty vehicles is probably the best one, where we want to start moving in that direction. The premium associated with those is currently higher than $150 a ton. We're seeing it starting to come down, but you're not going to justify those decisions on $150 a ton premium at this point. And so what we wanted to do was build in some space for if there was sort of other clear rationales in terms of really important to establish a leadership position in a specific market, maybe some other really important co-benefits such as air quality. We could work to quantify those on a case-by-case basis and sort of look at opportunities that go above the upper price in the carbon pricing policy. The last slide I was going to touch on was a bit on internal capacity building. So we did quite a bit of internal consultation, similar to what Marco described, sort of across different parts of the city, to develop the policy. Now that it's in place, we've been sort of running sort of briefing sessions, again, sort of focused on that sort of initial scope. So our real estate and facilities management team, our equipment services team, our zero waste teams, to sort of do deeper dives into the policy and the types of projects it could help open up. Also been sort of targeting at a senior management level, sort of across our engineering directors and finance directors, to make sure there's a good understanding of the policy. Probably the one we, sort of the most work we still need to do is around sort of our, the acronym there, BPPS, is our business planning and project support team, our bid committee and procurement teams, and just making sure there's a good understanding of the policy, and that where they have tools to evaluate projects, they've got a good understanding of the policy and are making sure it's applied consistently when projects are coming forward to bid committee, for example. The only internal tool we've developed to date is sort of a standardized emission factors tool, just to make it simpler for different parts of the city, especially as we sort of start looking into scope 3 emissions, wanting to make that approach as simple as possible for different parts of the city, and also not have different emission factors being used for the same decision. So we have those sort of pieces developed, and we'll keep those up to date. I think the other sort of big one isn't necessarily a standardized tool, but I think a good example would be our zero waste team. This approach has been, I'd say, it hasn't been particularly new thinking for our fleet team or our buildings team. I think already been sort of more or less in that type of thinking. When we get into some of the zero waste projects and landfill gas management projects, the carbon accounting and carbon side is, they're not unfamiliar with it, but it's a bigger step in learning on the carbon pricing policy. So we've been spending more time there, sort of just helping understand the carbon accounting of specific projects, and then the next step being to apply the carbon pricing policy. The one last thing I was going to say, just in terms of how it's been perceived, I think across the parts of the city where we're trying to advance projects to reduce emissions, it's generally been really well received. I think we've got a pretty long history in the city of trying to advance these projects, and people seeing this as an additional tool that fits pretty well with the way we're already making decisions, but sort of allows us to turn the dial a little bit faster and make more of those projects happen. From a finance perspective, I think it's also been pretty well received from a little bit of a different perspective. From their perspective, what they're seeing it as is a tool that provides some rigor and guidance around where we're going to be investing, so that we're not just automatically investing in every project to reduce emissions. And they have sort of some tools to assess, is this a cost-effective one in light of the targets we're trying to achieve? So just, I'll just leave the slide up here. There's my contact information. Happy to take further questions now or follow-ups later. The policy itself is public, so there's the link to it if you're interested in looking at it. Again, if people are interested in more of the background research we did to develop that, happy to share it as well. So thanks a lot.
Great, thanks so much, Matt. So anyone have questions for Matt about his presentation and their policy?
Hi, I'm with the City of Ann Arbor. I have a question. I was wondering, why did you guys decide to pursue a paper pricing rather than a fee or a tax? Did you think that the carbon pricing would have provided more results in terms of addressing emissions, or was the fee/tax too politically, was it too hard to implement that in terms of, I don't know, the politics going on with this?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a couple sort of main factors drove towards that. Like one, we knew fairly early on we wanted to strive for a reasonably high carbon price, and I think it was going to be a reasonably clear path towards getting that implemented as a price on paper. Saw that being much more challenging, if not impossible, at a higher price on if it was an actual internal price. And I think just the level of sort of change management we'd have to work through it would have just been a much more onerous undertaking. So given we think we can get the sort of the outcomes we want with the price on paper if it's consistently applied and used in the decision-making process, that was sort of the main reason that led us down that approach. I think, as I said at the beginning, where we've seen the internal sort of carbon taxes being used, they tend to be more fund generators to finance projects, and that wasn't what we were trying. That wasn't sort of our primary objective with this policy. It was to drive different decisions.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
Thanks, Missy. Anyone else for Matt or for Marco?
It's Mark here in New Westminster. So yes, we've thanks a lot to Metro Vancouver and Vancouver for taking the lead on that $150. One thing I was quite interested in is in Tech BC, they had sessions about carbon pricing and how it's going to affect the market. And we've been using the social price of carbon, the federal government, but it'd be really, really handy to have a market value. And in California, they have a spot market because of the low carbon vehicle standard, which is now averaging between $180 and $200 US a ton, which is what people have to pay as offsets. Is anyone using that market value to justify the price that they're putting on carbon so it's not a theoretical number?
It's a good question. I think you're referring to their low carbon fuel standard, which BC has a similar policy that trades in a similar range for the sources of emissions it applies to. So when we were looking at sort of the prices to set that sort of the market price, or almost sort of a risk management approach, I think it's fairly analogous to that. It did hold some appeal. I think the example you're giving, I think, is probably the highest one that's out there from a market context. Most of the ones push you into sort of a lower space. So I think we gravitated more towards sort of the models I mentioned. One was sort of the alignment with Metro Vancouver. The other was sort of the implicit price of what's needed to get to the types of targets that Vancouver, or BC, or Canada, or a number of other jurisdictions in the country have set. And so I think we gravitated more towards that approach, but I think you certainly could use some of those market models. I think you'll just see a big mix of where those prices are. Those low carbon fuel standard examples almost certainly, I think, being the highest. Other examples end up being much lower.
And you're saying that you're using a phased escalation, right? So do you say it was going to be up to about $300 a ton by 2030?
Yeah, subject to a couple of policy reviews in there, but that would be the default pathway.
Right. Connor, if you are on the line from Metro Van, is there anything you want to add about your policy, where it might differ, or any of the questions that have been asked?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, maybe just turn yourself up just a little bit.
Sure.
That's great.
Better, okay. Yeah, no, thanks. It's really great to get the update from Marco and Matt. I've seen your presentation or a similar version before, so it's good to get the refresher. What I really like about what City of Vancouver has done with this is they've taken it to the next level. I mean, we had really interesting conversations with our elected officials about the question of whether we would actually charge a price to projects and pay into a fund versus this paper price within our business casing, and it definitely worked out politically to support the quote unquote paper price. We are actually working on kind of a report back on the implementation of the carbon price, and in particular big projects that have been influenced by it over the last couple of years, or year and a half or so. And one of the things that's really interesting, and we want to be very clear when we report back, is that there are quite a few big infrastructure projects where we took into account the carbon price, and either internal staff did or our consultants did, and then it did not flip the decision, right? That is an important thing from a fiscal responsibility piece that we wanted to demonstrate, that it's not suddenly going to make our process to do capital planning and budget for these big infrastructure projects. It's not going to throw that into disarray. But there are other good examples where there was an important shift in our approach. So anyway, it's great to get this update, and thanks both Marco and Matt for your presentations.
I have a question to any of the three of you guys, actually. So how do you see this internal carbon pricing policy being sort of an evolution of 10 years ago when we all started trying to do these kind of triple bottom line analyses in our decision making for procurement? And I guess at the time they were a little bit more qualitative and had fewer quantitative. It was definitely more of a narrative analysis. Do you see this as replacing those kind of more soft triple bottom line analyses, or is there still a place for those?
I can take a crack. It's Matt here. So at least the way we have structured ours, and I think it's a fair characterization that we have a sort of in our procurement processes, for example, we have a fairly qualitative sustainability assessment as part of that. So we've designed this as a complement to that. So we still have that same, depends on the specific process, but 5, 10, 15% of the decision on sustainability criteria. I think our general internal assessment is it wasn't a tool that was driving a lot of good decision making, or it wasn't really pushing us to think hard about sort of the sustainability impacts of different decisions. So we're leaving it in there for now, and I think right now we've added this in as a complement to it, so it's sort of hardwired into the financial part of those assessments. I think there's been a number of conversations within City of Vancouver about are there other ways we could sort of add into this if it works well, and I think we're still pretty early days on the implementation side of it. But I think air quality has sort of been a big one where I think we could do the quantification on that. I know another example, San Francisco is working on sort of a cost or valuation of resilience in some of their as a policy piece they're working on. So I would see it being, if it works well, both opportunities to extend the reach of the carbon pricing policy, but also look at other environmental and sustainability aspects in similar ways. It's a little more concretely embedded in the decision-making process.
If I could add something to that, I think Metro Vancouver is taking quite a similar approach. We also have general sustainability and triple bottom line kind of considerations in procurement. I think what's really interesting and where the carbon prices shifted the conversation is that in the senior decision makers within our organization, there's a lot more discussion about capital budgets versus life cycle costs, and the trying to make a shift towards making decisions based on those life cycle costs. And this is a real challenge, right? Because we have budget approvals on an annual basis. We are moving towards 5-year and even 30-year capital planning processes, but still the budget is approved on an annual basis. And trying to build in those life cycle tools into the way we get those budgets approved is difficult. And Marco, I really liked your discussion about your identification of the challenge with a lack of consistency in how different groups do their business casing and do the life cycle cost analysis, if I interpreted that correctly, because we're also finding that same challenge internally. And I think the next thing that we'll be doing is to build a really consistent tool and process to do life cycle costing and use that to inform our capital planning.